in Jawaharlal Nehru University from 2004. Professor Haider graduated from the Aligarh Muslim University and obtained a doctoral degree from the University of Oxford on Mughal history. He became lecturer of medieval Asian history at the University of Delhi in 1998 and taught there till 2004. Professor Haider was a Hermes Research Fellow at Maison de Sciences de l'Homme, Paris, visiting fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, Samir Shama Fellow at St. Cross College and Faculty of Oriental Studies, University of Oxford, and visiting professor twice at the University of Vienna. Professor Haider was on the Executive Council of the Indian History Congress and Editorial Board of Studies in History. Recently, he was a part of the Indian delegation to Iran for an international seminar and dialogue on Indian-Iran relationship. Professor Haider has published on themes relating to monetary economy, international trade, intercultural communication, and intellectual history on Islam. He is currently working on the history of the Mughal book. Professor Haider was associated with the making of Ishq-e-Dilli, a sound and light show at Purana Killa, Delhi, and many documentaries, docudramas, such as the episode on Taj Mahal in the Superstructure series of BBC Discovery Channel, a documentary on the Indian history for the Lok Sabha channel, and another on forts of India. Professor Haider was also on the panel of experts for Group 3 project of a Franco-German National Geographic film, Secrets of the Taj, and several episodes of Epic Channel. Professor Haider teaches 2 core courses, each in monsoon and winter semesters, which are State in Medieval India, Power and Legitimacy, and State and Society in the Central Islamic Lands. In addition, he offers seminar papers on Persian documents and festivities and culture. Now we will be beginning with the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for very generous introduction. This presentation is a spin-off from my interest in the history of power and communication in pre-modern India, particularly in Mughal India. I was always interested while reading court chronicles or epigraphs or coin legends on how the ruler and his rule was communicated. And this is some kind of putting together of literary and visual evidence. I am not using in my presentation any theory on communication. It's a simple interpretation of a set of evidence, and I'm sure you'll have questions and comments and suggestions to put this in a way which you think is more productive and useful. Just a bit of an introduction that the Mughal Empire was established in 1586 as a dynastic empire, so nobody outside the dynasty had the right to rule. That was very important. That was the reason why during wars of succession, nobles and war chiefs supporting rival claimants to the throne were never punished but always incorporated within the state structure because they were supporting the dynasty, even if they were supporting another prince. So there was a very strong element which you can see in this painting, where Timur is shown handing the crown to Babur, with Humayun sitting to his left, and their prime ministers are standing. The Mughals were Turco-Mongol. Babur was related to Timur from his father's side and to Changiz from his mother's side. If you want to remember which side is which, just remember that Babur's mother was called Nigar Khanam, and Khanam is a feminine of Khan, which is a typical Mongol title. Whereas from his father's side, they were all Mirzas, which was a Turkish title, son of an Amir Zada. So this Turco-Mongol lineage was considered to be a very powerful source of legitimacy to rule in a large part of Central Asia, which also included eastern parts of eastern Khorasan, eastern Iran or Khorasan, Timur's bailiwick. And therefore, when Babur was not able to establish himself in this part, then of course he decided he first settled in Afghanistan and then came to India and conquered India and transplanted this right to rule, because Timur had conquered India in the late 14th century. The rulers never called themselves Mughals. Actually, it's a name which we have given to them. Indians always called those who invaded India from the northwest Mughal, anglicized Mongol. So in the entire Delhi Sultanate literature, particularly in the 14th century, you will see hordes of Mughal invading India, sometimes camping across the Yamuna. And we all know that Alauddin Khilji had to leave the old city of, the old Qutub Mehroli city and the fort to fight them in Siri, a plain of Siri, which was a very fateful encounter. Had he not won, there would have been a different history of the Delhi Sultanate. And when he won, he built his capital in Siri, which is what present Siri fort is. All these people were Mughals. And when Babur came and invaded, his dynasty too was called Mughal. And the term was picked by many European, Portuguese, Italian travelers and visitors, mercenaries, and transported to. That's why we have many variations of this term, as Mogor, for instance, Manucci's Mogor. But they call themselves Timuria or Chaghtaiya, which again is a recollection of their Turco-Mongol heritage. But we'll use the term Mughal because that's what our textbooks have, and we follow our textbooks very faithfully. Here you have Babur, very nice portrait of Babur from an album, Muraqqa, and the area from where he started, modern Kazakhstan, Farghana, and in his memoirs he has a very good description of this area, particularly Farghana. And then he moved to Afghanistan, and from Afghanistan he came to India. Babur's memoirs are also a very important source for the history of the first half of the 16th century. Remember, this is the period when we do not have any history. Everything started in the second half with Akbar commissioning or Humayun commissioning, but for this period we do not have anything except for this, and this is very rich because he is noticing practically everything which any Indian wouldn't, like peacocks and rhinos. We may not write about these birds and animals with such enthusiasm as he did, because he had absolutely no idea, and he was seeing these birds of different plumes, for instance, in his autobiography. His autobiography is also a very good illustration of his Turco-Mongol heritage. It's written in Turkish and not in Persian, which had become the language of high culture and administration in Central Asia. But it was translated into Persian in Akbar's court by no other person than Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan, our dear friend Rahim, whose doha we remember, even though he may not have composed them, but there are so many dohas attributed to Rahim. Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan translated the whole text, and it was illustrated. So the passages which you see interspersed here are in Persian and not in Chagtai Turkish. But the real founder of the Mughal Empire was Akbar, And this is a very short synopsis of his military conquest. Just look at the chronology from 1560s, and I have only started from Gujarat because there was a major campaign, to 1595 when a large part of Iran and Afghanistan was conquered, to a whole set of administrative measures, fiscal and monetary policies, which lasted for over 150 years. It was a huge enterprise. And I'm not surprised that this painting, commissioned by Shah Jahan, shows Akbar giving the crown to him and not to Jahangir. It's an allegorical painting like the first one, but it's full of symbolism, because Akbar he cast a very long shadow, and he was remembered in very many different ways, as we shall see. One remarkable aspect of his state was that it had a particular kind of politico-religious ideology called absolute peace, or Sulh-e-Kul. Very interesting concept, drawn from religion and used to shun religion away from the state. So, curious paradox, but we'll look at the policy of Sulh-e-Kul. A lot of what we know about Akbar and his official policies, his campaigns, all these achievements that are listed are from this major monumental work commissioned by him called Akbarnama, written by his friend and ideological counselor. We know Abul Fazl more as a court chronicler, which he wasn't actually. We also think, following Beveridge, that he was a shameless panegyrist, and he left no stone unturned to praise his patron. We don't quite realize that he genuinely thought that Akbar was great. See, we never make this distinction between the functionalist, instrumentalist aspect of a piece of writing and the real genuine feeling. Now, you may disagree with him and say that he wasn't, but that was not Abul Fazl's problem. He always actually thought that this man was a genius. I'm sorry, this is not a very clear painting, but this is a famous Badshah Nama, Windsor Castle Badshah Nama painting by Balchand, in which Prince Khurram is touching the feet of his father. This is the only painting in which you see the Mughals adopting this Indian tradition. But that's not why I'm showing you this. You can see that there's a portrait of Akbar at the top. And it's a 3-generation painting. And there are some nice legends written below that we will decipher later. This is just to show how, what kind of legacy Akbar left, and the Mughal state, even including that of Aurangzeb, by the way, largely functioned within the framework of Sulh-e-Kul, except for when there were deviations, partly in Shah Jahan's period and partly in Aurangzeb's. Now, the Mughal state, you must have read in Bertenstein's book that there was no state in India, and what we had was a segmentary state. It's a way to qualify the notion of state. Based on, and I'm using Bertenstein as a shorthand to address a large body of historiographical literature, mostly produced in the West, which argues that since the Indian society is divided into so many sensibilities, region, caste, language, community, it's not possible for a society like this to transcend these sensibilities and create a mature political organization akin to state. That's the philosophical underpinning of Bertenstein's segmentary state. The other school, Aligarh school and others, and I'm also using the Aligarh school not in purely geographical terms, because we have people like John F. Richards, late Tapan Rai Chaudhary, Satish Chandra, who all belong to this school who have argued that no, there was a strong state. And for the moment we are following this tradition that there was a strong monarchical state based on the absolute authority of the king, which, as I mentioned, was based on a concept of undivided sovereignty. Even members of the royal household had no right whatsoever over the office of the monarch, unlike the Timurid tradition or the Changezid tradition. This is also very interesting, that there was this element of confederacy instilled in the Mongol and Timurid polity in Central Asia, but not in India, where I think medieval Indian traditions were used to consolidate the institution of monarchy and insulate it against any notion of parcelization of sovereignty. Now, how was this idea communicated is what we are going to look at. How is the idea of this strong ideal state headed by a monarch who is very able, who is legitimate because he belongs to a particular family, but that's not the only thing. Because he belongs to a particular family, God is very happy with him. So a deadly combination of genealogy and divinity. And once God is happy and He has selected you to rule, then of course everything is easy. Any rebellion against you is bound to fail, and you will preside a kingdom which is based on, which is very peaceful, which is very prosperous. And that's exactly, so what we are going to look at, this rhetoric and this idea which was communicated in various ways. And of course then we can question all this. We are dealing with a whole bunch of very self-conscious people who had a particular image of themselves which they wanted to communicate, which also then invites the problem of deciphering which part of which is genuine and which part of it is purely rhetorical. That's a very, very big question. Any critique of the Mughal rhetoric of sovereignty has to look at these two registers and find out which one is genuine and which one is purely. And one way in which we can address this question is to look at these ways of communication. Well, just quickly to tell you that there was a very strong culture of Persian literary composition right from the days of the Delhi Sultans in the 13th century, or if you want to go back to the Ghaznavid rule in Punjab, the famous Diwan of Masood Saad Salman, which was supposed to be the first proper composition in Persian, down to the days of the Mughals, there was a very rich culture. And you'll be surprised to know that the number of manuscripts, Persian manuscripts, written in India are 2 to 3 times more than the entire composition of Iranian and Central Asian literature put together. So this was the volume of literature produced in India, partly because India was a vast country and also because there were resources. People were patronized not from India but also from outside, Central Asia, Iran, from other parts of the world, sparingly but largely from Iran and Turan. Paper also was manufactured for the first time in the 14th century. So we had no paper before that. We imported paper, and after the production of paper in different parts of the country, it became very cheap, so much so that people could use and throw. But there was a time when Sultan's farmans were washed and reused. So production of paper was a very important way also of dissemination of literary culture. We can also include business in this. You can imagine how much this discovery of new ways of making paper with new raw material in India propped up business transactions, ledgers, IOUs, letter of credits, all kinds of things. But for the moment we stick to literary culture. A new genre of writing history also flourished. Now, when I say that, I am conscious of Professor Ramila Thapar's book that Indians always had a sense of history. And this sense was reflected in very many ways, in genealogies of Vanchavalis, in poetry, in other semi-fictitious forms of literary writings. Now that's quite all right. We all think about our past, but we don't all write our autobiographies. Because the genre is simply not there. We start writing our autobiographies only if we know that there is something called this, and therefore we write. We may keep diaries, but in diary you can't intervene in diaries in the way you can intervene in your autobiography. So, tarikh or conscious composition of historical chronicles, organized strictly sometimes in order of time with certain philosophical assumptions about history. Ziauddin Barni was a 14th century historian of Delhi. He came from Bulandshahr, but he was brought up in Delhi. Has something like 10 pages in his book Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi on what is history. It's some kind of a medieval E.H. Carr. Who can write history? And 10 pages of Persian would mean at least 20 pages of English, because it's a very economical language. If you translate 10 pages, then you'll have 20-25 pages of English. Why history should not be read by riffraffs? Who is a good historian? All that. So there was a lot of energy, intellectual energy, which was spent on thinking about this genre of writing, history, what we call today as the discipline of history. So put together, there was a very rich repertoire of means of communication, which were possibly not available to previous dynasties or population, literate population, as in the 16th and 17th century. Now this is a passage which I have selected from Abul Fazl's Ain-e-Akbari, which you all know is the third part of the Akbarnama. The Akbarnama is divided into, let's say the second part, is divided into two parts. One is the chronicle of Akbar and Akbar's India, and the other is some kind of a gazetteer of information. Fascinating. With, for the first time, a huge assemblage of quantitative data, figures and statistics, which you will not see in any composition before or after Abul Fazl. I don't think anybody had the heart to get into this kind of business of collecting statistics. But the third part, or the second part if you like, why I'm calling it third part, because the Akbarnama is also split into two, pre-Akbar and Akbar. That's the idea. If you are writing about your patron, you just dismiss the previous emperors in one volume and then write a full volume on your patron. So that's the composition. And the latter part is the Ain. So look at this quotation. Badshahi is a light from God and a ray from the world illuminating sun, Aftab-e Alam Afroz. In the language of today, which is Persian, it is called Far-e Yazdi, or divine light. It is communicated by God to kings without the intermediate assistance of anyone. And men in the presence of it bend the forehead of praise towards the ground of submission, Zamine Parastari. There is so much. I think Abul Fazl must have written something like 5 pages and then distilled it in this passage. That we know because he revised his book 4 or 5 times. And when he was doing it for the 5th or 6th time, I don't remember, then Akbar said, now that's enough, I want my book. And there's a very nice painting in Chester Beatty, Dublin, where you can see a chubby Abul Fazl presenting a copy of Akbarnama to Akbar. So it's a very distilled version of Abul Fazl's view of kingship. Badshahi is a light from God and a ray from the world illuminating sun. So it's not only divine light, but it's possible also to identify a more mundane source of this light, which is the sun. And that we should remember. It is communicated by God to kings without any intermediary. Now everybody is out. All prophets are out. All saints are out. All theologians are out. Nobody, theologians, by the way, the ulama, which is a very powerful category of people with discrete subcategories, jurists, philosophers, they are not in communication with God in the same way as the ruler is. So this is a master stroke of getting in touch with God directly, without the assistance of anybody. And Abul Fazl has a passage in his Ain-e-Akbari where he says that there were lots of people in the past who thought that they were representatives of God on earth and also decided to rule, but their rule was disastrous. Now he's not naming anyone, but if you read it carefully, he means all the prophets who were, including the Prophet of Islam, who thought that they could establish political dynasties or kingdoms. Dynasty when he's talking about Solomon and David. Kingdoms on the basis of religion, but they failed. So clearly there are new elements about kingship which you don't find elsewhere. Now, those of you who have watched this famous Mughal-e-Azam would remember that Akbar is called Zill-e-Ilahi, which means shadow of God on earth. Now, no such thing here. There is no shadow. It's all light. The Mughals will not accept any dark thought about kingship. So it's all light. It's Farre-Yazdi, which is an ancient Iranian pre-Islamic expression used for kingship. So they are trying to reach the Iranian Achaemenid Sasanian tradition without getting any involvement, without getting the Islamic history, or without getting the notion of rulership in Islamic history involved in this. And of course, everybody has to obey such a king, There is a Zameen Parastari. Parastish is the closest you can. Parastish or worship is, of course, and this Akbar says many times in his sayings, and Abul Fazl also, that the only entity worthy of worship is God. So all this talk you have on Deen-e-Ilahi, and Akbar wanted to become or assume a position analogous to God, and Allahu Akbar means Akbar is Allah. All this is nonsense, believe me, because there are at least 10 to 15 statements put together, some by Abul Fazl, some by Akbar, where he says that God is the only entity worthy of worship. He is powerful, He is omnipotent, He is omniscient, and I am His humble servant, and I am very grateful that He has given me so much, and I would also like to give something back to Him. And in fact, there was a period when he had huge depression because he was not finding any useful way to repay his debts to God. So the point of showing this passage was that there are new ideas and new concepts which are all arrayed to consolidate the position of the king as somebody who is over and above all religions, all religious leaders, all religious ideas, and he is in direct communication with God. Now you might question this, as I said, but Abul Fazl will bring you a whole range of evidence to buttress the and his book is full of, and sometimes you can dismiss it as purely legendary, sometimes you can, how the manner in which he judges people, the manner in which he judges situations, the manner in which he judges battle strategies, and given the fact that he didn't lose any, and many of these battles were fought when he was not there and he was only sending instruction. So all this convinced poor Abul Fazl that his patron was, and then what we have is this very interesting idea that the king is not only a divinely ordained being, but he is also a perfect man, which is a Sufi idea. Just imagine, we know Sufis as people who are austere, who renounce the world, who live in khanqahs, who are also unkempt. They are called God's friends. There's a medieval jurist who asked why God's friends are so dirty and why don't they bathe? Because they are not bothered. Now imagine that, and imagine the Mughal sovereign who is, we'll look at his dress and the trappings of sovereignty. It's a concept drawn from Ibn al-Arabi's mysticism. He was an Andalusian mystic and philosopher, which simply put says that there are certain people in different epochs of time which are selected by God, and herein lies the interesting bit, because they are perfect people. They do not become perfect because they are selected by God. Any theologian or Sufi can come and say, look, I know God. The concept of piety in Islam means knowing God. I know God more than you, and I am in communion with God more than you, so how can you claim? No. God chooses certain rulers because they are already pre-made, and then the choice falls on them, and once the choice falls on them, then there is no stopping. They can just go all the way. So you have this very interesting concept of insan-e-kamil, a perfect man, which is some of it we will see in our discussion. But one important aspect of insan-e-kamil is, one trait of insan-e-kamil is that he is perfect in both worldly and spiritual matters. Now you might think that this is some kind of a theological claptrap. It isn't. Many medieval scholars, including those who wrote outside India, made a firm distinction between surat and mani. We also make it all the time, believe me. When we meet someone, we are impressed, but after some time we realize that when you scratch the surface, there is nothing inside. Now that is surat. And a lot of people only look at that. But it's actually mani that matters. The ability to see things beyond what is ostensible, what is evident. And this is how he ties up Akbar's achievements with his ability. So if you judge a situation correctly, it's not because you are looking at an army or a battle situation, but because you can look beyond. So this ability, which is not fully articulated in Sufism in the way in which it is articulated here. Spiritualism in Sufism or mainstream Islam is understanding mysteries of God or divinity. It's not about worldly matters. But here this concept is transformed into a potent concept of understanding this world as well as the other world. So you can see they are insulating themselves with all kinds of powerful concepts, and as we shall see, they are communicating it as well. Now what is Sulhekul? As I said, it's a mystic notion derived from Ibn al-Arabi. It means obviously a politically stable and administratively strong state. It also means a religiously tolerant state, which means that even if the ruler does not like religion, and here I mean religion, not a religion. Both Abul Fazl and Akbar thought that all religions are false. They didn't advertise it very much, But they thought that all religions are false, all religions are nothing but organized superstition. But how do you deal with a population, this is very relevant today, which is so religious, deeply religious, which can do anything in the name of religion? And believe me, there were people in those days as there are today. So how do you handle such a paradoxical situation in which you know that when Todermal is praying to his idols, they are not going to save him? Todermal practically got himself killed because in a battle situation, he had to come back to collect his idols. Because he thought he was going to be, he was traveling without his idol was an act of irreligiosity. Now this whole episode became a subject of discussion. And Akbar invited him and talked to him and said, look, who is your real Lord? And he said, my Lord, you are mine. So what's your problem? So my idols are lost and until I get them back, I can't eat. He was not eating. For 3 days, he was starving, not eating, not drinking. And Akbar had to then speak to him and say, look, they are not your real Lord, I am your Lord. And he confessed, so am I not alive? I am not in front of you. Why don't you go and eat something? And he went and ate. So they routinely criticized all major Islamic rituals and superstitions. So this interesting situation in which you have a ruler who is deeply skeptical towards the concept of religion or organized religion. Yet he has to give money to temples, mosques, churches, all kinds of establishments, grants, land grants. The idea of giving land grants to religious establishment is a purely Indian idea. It does not exist in any part of the Islamic world. You look at the history of Islam and you will see cash stipends, offices, other kinds of helps, but never a piece of land. This is our famous Brahmadeya tradition, where Brahmins and then, of course, later on other religious establishments, the Mughals inherited this concept. And also terribly tormented by this contradiction of not appreciating what was happening in the name of religion, and also at the same time supporting. We'll come back to this point later, how they tried to handle this situation. So our first image is of a Mughal, very interesting Mughal silver and gold coin, but what you see here is a rupee, is a square rupee of Akbar, which has a very peculiar feature. It has the Islamic millenarian expression Alf written on the obverse, on the reverse. On the obverse is the Kalima or La ilaha illallah, and on the reverse is the Alf written, which was a concept in Islam that after a period of time, let's say 1000 years, the world will come to an end. It's an apocalyptic concept. And then there will be somebody who will usher the society into a new era. And that was 990 Hijri or 1582 AD, which was the 1000 years of Islam. Not 1000 years from by the Hijri calendar. I hope I'm able to communicate this. It's a bit of a tricky thing. But if you reckon the life of Islam, it's not from the first Hijri year. Okay, it's from minus 10 Hijri because the Prophet started preaching 10 years before the Hijrah. So all Hijri calendars were set aside and a new calibration of time with this Alf legend. And the understanding that Akbar was the millennial Messiah. And he was the one who was going to lead his subjects, not only Muslims, but also especially the Muslims, let's say, but the rest into a new era where they can attain salvation. The idea of all millennial movements is that on the day of judgment, humanity should not be ashamed of itself, should cleanse itself so that it can face God, and that primordial covenant that has been made with God, that I would never stray from the right path, that could be at least partially fulfilled. So there was this, for 10 years, this huge advertisement of the idea of millennium and Akbar as millennial Messiah. A monumental history of the world was commissioned called Tarikh-e-Alfi. The National Museum has a copy of that manuscript and it's on display. Some pages of it are on display. You can go and a huge monumental work with a team of scholars working on it. All this for something like 10-15 years. I can't explain how all this was recorded by a man who was writing a secret history of Akbar. His courtier, who was very unhappy with all this, who thought all these innovations, and innovation is a religiously loaded term in Islam, or bid'ah, are going to destroy the religion. So he is secretly writing this, never wanting his work to be made public. It was only later that his book came out. And thank God for that, because we now have a counter view of Abul Fazl. And in which he says what kind of a country India has become. Anybody can say anything, anybody can preach any religion or ideas. When I was a student in Aligarh University, I thought this was JNU. Today JNU is so different that if you have to say something, you have to think twice. So Badayuni has this very nice passage in his Muntakhabut Tawarikh where he is very unhappy with all these new ideas on religion and politics that are being adumbrated in Akbar's court, particularly by the king and his counselors. Then came another phase, a more interesting phase in which divinity, as we saw in Abul Fazl's quotation, was severed from its Islamic linkages. After all, Alf was an Islamic idea. And even though you may have had millenarian notions in other religions like Christianity, this was essentially an Islamic notion. So it was abandoned, and a new notion of divinity based, sovereignty based on divinity. When they use the word, when they use expressions for divinity, they don't use standard Muslim terms. Abul Fazl never uses Allah, for instance. He never uses the term Islam. For Islam, he has a very interesting term called, which can be loosely translated as Mohammedanism. And just in case you think that Mohammedanism is some kind of pejorative Orientalist innovation, it isn't. It's already there in medieval Islamic literature because of the simple fact that if you remove Muhammad, there is nothing left in Islam. The Quran goes, the Prophet goes, everything goes. So Muhammadi Kesh is the term which he uses for Islam. And the new notion of divinity and a new notion of sovereignty is expressed in this very nice portrait muhar, gigantic portrait muhar of Jahangir, where you can see the symbol of the sun in the middle and Jahangir holding the wine cup characteristically, and another painting which I think is made later. This coin is 1614 and Jahangir pierced his ear in 1618. So this must be 1618, but you can see that the idea continues. Not because he liked drinking. Of course he did. And he said that if you drink in moderation, there is nothing wrong with that. And he also gives a blow-by-blow account of how much he's drinking every day. But because wine drinking is a very strong metaphor in Sufism. And that's the reason why in Sufi poetry you will find the Sufi not in the mosque but in a tavern. And he's making fun of those who are sitting in the mosque. Because the tavern is the real place where he is going to have communion with God. Why? Because wine is one thing, and we all know this, which reduces inhibition and brings out all your innate feelings, very necessary for Sufic communion, to the fore. And you start then thinking about God in a way you can't if you are heavily immersed into worldly affairs and worldly thinkings. So you may have seen that we start speaking the truth once we are drunk, and sometimes we speak too much. So the idea of wine drinking therefore was given a completely different spin in Sufism. It's full, therefore, Persian poetry of Hafiz, for instance, is full of metaphors of wine drinking. And so the wine cup which you see in Jahangir's hand is an allegorical representation of that particular act of drinking that wine, which is full of Hubbe Khuda, or love of, and as you know, love is the cardinal principle in Sufism, love of God, which is understood in worldly terms. Ishq-e haqiqi is understood in terms of Ishq-e majazi, and this is a representation of that. A very rare painting of Akbar, which is in Jaipur, which I don't think many people are, and I am thankful to my friend Catherine Asher, who sent a copy of this to me. Akbar praying to the sun. And on the basis of this painting, many historians have written that Akbar was a sun worshipper, Aftab Parast. Just as Zoroastrians are called in traditional Islamic literature Atash Parast, or fire worshipper. Now this is not a modern concept. Badayuni says that His Majesty is worshipping the sun these days. Now if you read Abul Fazl and put the two together, the text and the image, you will see that Akbar is not praying to the sun. He is praying to God. Sun is just the symbol of divinity. It's also a curious inversion of the traditional Islamic way of praying towards facing the Qibla is the west. In the mosque is always, if you enter a mosque in India, you enter from the east and you go to the west because that's the Qibla. Here the Qibla is east, not the west. Because of the influence of the famous Ishraqi philosophy on Akbar, where Ishraq or Sharq or east is supposed to be the right Qibla from where knowledge, wisdom, divinity all emanated. And those of us who are diehard nationalists and think that the east is the cradle of all civilizations should seize this philosophy and this painting. I'm sorry I have spoken more than I should, so I'm going to quickly show you the paintings that I have put together. I only have 5 minutes. But this is an interesting passage in which Akbar is inverting, and I'm sure under Abul Fazl's influence, inverting the traditional Islamic prohibition against painting. The traditional Islamic notion is that only God has the right to create. Nobody else has. And on the day of judgment, the artist will be asked to breathe life in his creation. And since they won't be able to do that because only God can do that, they'll be tossed in hell. So they all stop painting. Now look at this logic where it is said that painting is an act of worship. Because once you have painted, you realize your limitation, that you can't breathe no matter how good is your painting. You can't breathe life into it, and only God can do that. So just read this passage where it says, for a painter in sketching anything that has life must come to feel that he cannot bestow personality on his work. This is a rough translation. And is thus forced to think of God, the giver of life. And this increases his knowledge. You can translate the expression, this also is an act of worship. And that opened the window for the famous Akbari atelier, from which a large number of paintings were produced, and I'm going to show you some of them. This is another interesting passage in which the cross-fertilization of Iranian, Turani or Central Asian and Indian tradition is presented, where many Indian artists become masters. I'm sorry, we have to... Well, even if I take 5 more minutes, I don't think I'll be able to finish. I know why, because I am wired into 2 hours of JNU lectures, and it's very difficult to, but I'm going to show you some paintings which are based on, well, broadly speaking, there were 2 trends, and we can fix the chronology also. One is what we can call historical realism, where you show things as they really are, and that is the touchstone. And the other is symbolism, or allegorical representation of things. For the best part of Akbar's reign, historical realism was the watchword. And artists competed among themselves to show who can really draw something exactly. So if it's a flower, then the bee should come. If it's a candle, the moth should come. That kind of a competition. Some of it persisted in Jahangir's time. This is the famous portrait of one of Jahangir's courtiers, Inayat Khan, who was dying of excessive opium consumption. And Jahangir was so distraught, and he was disturbed, that he commissioned this painting. He said, I've never seen somebody degenerating, because this is Inayat Khan in his prime. But there was a major shift to allegorical painting. And these paintings were therefore used largely under the influence of European painters and their works which were brought to India. It wasn't as if the Indian mind was not capable of imagination, but there were certain things which had to be shown. There was no concept of halo, for instance. If you look at medieval Islamic paintings, which are very good, if the face of the Prophet had to be masqueraded, you will see a burst of flame, for instance. Now, that was changed completely when they got to see much better or much more sophisticated way of showing the impact of an influence of divinity. So, as I told you, these are all allegorical paintings. Now you see the halo coming around Akbar. Both these are posthumous paintings, because Akbar never allowed any liberty from reality in his painting. He had a slight limp, and all his paintings show the limp. There was a standing instruction that his mole, his limb, should always be shown in the portraits. So that was the standard of realism. But luckily Jahangir thought that no, there is a world beyond this, and you have nice halos around the... Another one in which you not only have a halo, or say half-formed halo. This is the transition halo. There's a flame and a halo also. There is no nimbus, which we saw earlier. But there are angels bringing crown. But look at the lower register of the painting. This is the famous allegorical representation of peaceful pairing of animals. Painted by Govardhan. Govardhan's name is written down there. Where the lion and the cow or a calf are sitting together, and you can't say that the lion has not seen the calf. and that's why they are sitting apart. No, actually the artist made it sure that they look at each other, and this is actually one way in which Sulh-e-Kul was communicated. That there is peace not only among human beings who are otherwise cantankerous and fight all the time. The Mughal political sovereignty was premised on some kind of pessimistic anthropology. Human beings are bad, they always fight. You need a king or a ruler, a tyrant sometimes. Qahr-e-Wahdat is the term which Abul Fazl uses. The tyranny of one individual. Sometimes we call it democracy also in these days. The tyranny of one individual it has to be used to discipline people, and that's how the world, a social order particularly, but all kinds of worldly orders are established. Another very nice illustration of Shah Jahan standing on the globe with a parasol, and there are puttis. We saw them earlier also. There's one holding a parasol. There's a fully formed nimbus here, and don't miss the nice jamas with floral patterns and the nice pair of slippers. It's a lion and a lamb, and they are, sitting together as if really they haven't heard the story of the lion and the lamb. This is by Hashim, and we have all the details of the painting, including the place and time and everything there. Don't miss the balance, also communicating the idea of justice. We know that the first thing which Jahangir did after he became king, that he instituted a chain of justice in Agra, one end of which was tied to the parapets of his Agra palace, a burj, and the other was on the bank of the river so that anybody could come and shake. And this was not simple propaganda. We have a film called Pukar in which you can actually see that happening. No, I'm just kidding. We have lots of examples of people coming and shaking, and there is also a painting in which some people are trying to get in but they are stopped. You may have read in Skelton and others that this shows the reality of Mughal justice, that even though there is a chain of justice, nobody has access to it, but that's not the meaning of the painting. What Jahangir is trying to, I hope I could show you that painting. Jahangir is trying to show is that, look, this was the previous practice, that people were stopped from entering, and this is the current practice where they can come and shake the chain of justice. So justice therefore became, or adl. It's a very old concept, and whenever they talk of adl, they invoke not Islamic figures but ancient Iranians. So Anushirwan is the hero, and the adl of Anushirwan or Naushirwan-e Adil is the real standard which the Mughal emperors have to follow. Yet another one in which you can see the peaceful pairing of animals. Now here the symbolism is slightly different. This is a painting of Jahangir embracing the Iranian king Shah Abbas. With a huge, you can see, image of the sun and the moon, threading the eye of the sun, and the two angels holding. This is a famous, the literal expression is Daulate-Ab Paiban. In Hindi, the best interpretation of this is in Hindi. Jab tak suraj chand rahega. That's as long as the sun and the moon will last. That's the inscription there somewhere. But why is it that Jahangir is standing on a lion and Shah Abbas standing on a lamb? Now, the two had never met. This is a dream sequence, like the famous Hitchcock dream sequence of Salvador Dali type. you have a challenge. This is the time when Jahangir has lost Kandahar to Shah Abbas. He cannot do anything. He's too busy with other things. So what he could do is to send an artist to Isfahan, get Shah Abbas painted. So if you look at the portrait of Shah Abbas, it's exactly the same as you will find in Safavid paintings. But the embrace is purely allegorical, and you can see that Jahangir's lion is trying to push Shah Abbas's lamb into the Mediterranean. That's the best he could do after losing Kandahar. And this is my final painting, and this is a real final one, which I think is the best allegorical painting which represents sovereignty. Jahangir is sitting on an interesting hourglass-like throne, and there are two little angels who are collecting the sand of time, and there are four figures. The first one, the larger one, is that of a Sufi sheikh. You can see it from the white turban that he's wearing. Then you have the portrait of an Ottoman king, possibly his namesake Salim. Then you have James the First. And then the last one is the most interesting one. It's Bichitra, the painter's. It's the first selfie you are looking at. It's Bichitra himself who is there, holding a portrait which he had previously painted, so that you don't mistake him for anyone else. So what is there in the painting? At the top, at the masthead, you have a couplet. Badshah surato mani ast az lutfe ilah, Shah Nuruddin Jahangir ibn Akbar Badshah, Garch dar surat Shah daran pedar peshe qiyam, Lek dar mani badarvesha kunat tayem nikah. It's absolutely fantastic. Why? Because this is what they were trying to do all this while, saying, look, the king is not only the master of this world, not only the world of Surat, but he is also the master of the world of Mani. And in this reversal of transmission of knowledge from the side of the Sufi to the side of the ruler, which had been the case earlier, it's the king who is giving a book, symbol of knowledge, to the Sufi, and the Sufi is accepting in that traditional way in which we accept things, jholi phaila ke lena. I hope you are familiar with this Hindi expression in which you accept something in modesty by extending a piece of cloth. This is the famous Indian way of accepting things, and this is the Sufi, not Jahangir accepting anything from him but giving him. And surprise, surprise, you have the Ottoman king and the English monarch, who I think is bored and he's starting to walk. No, but that's not the Mughals only had known of James the First through a painting in which he's shown like this. So didn't really work too much on that, and that's why he's looking. But the poetry says that although kings stand before him in appearance, in reality he looks towards the dervishes. So all that he's a powerful worldly king is okay. There is no big deal with that. They have a territory, even though they have lost Kandahar, they have a territory, a large territorial nexus. But it's this particular claim which nobody has had earlier that has to be brought out in this painting. And there are a couple of other things, but I'm sorry, I have already overstepped. This is this is again an Indian expression which means tum jio hazaro saal. So what the angels are doing, they are bringing the sand of time back onto the bottom, onto the top part of the hourglass, so that the lifespan of the king can be lengthened to a ton. What interesting way of doing it, isn't it? I think this will put a lot of pharmaceutical industries out of business. So this is the image of the sovereign, worldly and spiritual, divinely ordained, with a gift of knowledge which he can give to others, just as he can give the light of God to others. The light of God comes to the king and then gets reflected. He is also benevolent, he is also just and fair, and that's how, I'm sorry I was not able to show you a couple of other images which have similar claims to make, but I think I have given you enough food for thought, and we can have a discussion on that. Thank you very much.